120 Australian soldiers walked into a command briefing at Long Bin in May of 1966. A United States Army colonel stood at the front, maps of Phuoc Tuy province spread across the table, ready to issue operational directives to what he assumed would be just another Allied unit under his authority. He pointed to sectors on the map, outlined patrol routes, detailed American-style search and destroy parameters. The Australian commander, Brigadier O.D. Jackson, listened politely for exactly 3 minutes before standing up. He gathered his maps, nodded to his officers, and walked toward the door. The American colonel called after him, voice sharp with confusion and authority, "Brigadier, where do you think you're going? We haven't finished the operational briefing." Jackson turned at the doorway, his response 3 words that would echo through classified military channels for the next 5 years. "We don't comply." Wait, what? A brigadier from Australia, a nation providing fewer than 8,000 troops to a war consuming 500,000 Americans, just walked out on a United States Army colonel? A colonel who had direct authority from Military Assistance Command Vietnam, the supreme Allied command structure in Southeast Asia. Oh, this story gets so much stranger than you think, because what those 120 Australians were about to do in Phuoc Tuy province, the operational autonomy they were about to demand, the methods they were about to employ without American oversight, would produce results so effective and so controversial that Pentagon analysts would spend the next decade trying to understand how a force 1/60th the size of American deployment achieved tactical outcomes American divisions could not. One classified assessment, written in 1970 by a Military Assistance Command Vietnam intelligence officer who had served alongside the Australians, contained a conclusion that would remain buried in classified archives for 40 years. 7 words that explained everything and nothing. They fight wars we forgot how to. You're about to discover why the smallest Allied contingent in Vietnam operated under its own command, answered to its own chain, and refused to adopt American doctrine even when Washington threatened to cut support. And trust me, by the end of this, you'll understand why Viet Cong intelligence documents from 1969 carried a specific warning about the Australians, a warning written in language that suggested something beyond ordinary military respect, something closer to dread. Stay with me. The thing about Australian military culture that Americans never quite grasped, the fundamental difference that made integration into United States command structure virtually impossible, wasn't about tactics or training or equipment. It was about memory, specifically the memory of Singapore. February 15, 1942. The supposedly impregnable British fortress, the Gibraltar of the East, the anchor of Commonwealth defense in the Pacific, surrendered to Japanese forces after a campaign lasting barely 70 days. 130,000 Allied troops, including 15,000 Australians, marched into captivity. Not because they had been outfought in conventional battle, but because British command had deployed forces according to European doctrine in an Asian jungle environment where European doctrine meant absolutely nothing. The Australian survivors of Changi Prison, of the Burma Railway, of the death marches that claimed 8,000 Australian lives, came home with a lesson seared into their consciousness. Following British or American command without question, without the ability to adapt tactics to local conditions, without operational independence, was a death sentence. This wasn't theoretical knowledge passed down through military academies. This was lived experience, carried by men who were still serving, still teaching, still leading when Vietnam started calling for volunteers. When Australia committed combat troops to Vietnam in 1965, the political leadership in Canberra faced an immediate structural problem. The Australian government wanted to support American efforts in Southeast Asia, wanted to demonstrate alliance commitment, wanted to ensure United States military presence in the region continued. But the Australian military leadership, the men who had fought in Malaya during the emergency, who had watched British command structures slowly adapt to counterinsurgency warfare through painful trial and error, who had developed their own doctrine through jungle operations in Borneo during the Indonesian confrontation, these men had no intention of subordinating Australian forces to American operational control. The initial compromise seemed simple. Australia would send one battalion, the 1st Battalion Royal Australian Regiment, to serve as the 3rd Infantry Battalion of the United States 173rd Airborne Brigade at Bien Hoa. Australian soldiers under American command, integrated into American operations, following American doctrine. It lasted exactly 9 months before the complaints started flowing back to Canberra. The problem wasn't that American methods were wrong. In conventional warfare, in open terrain, against massed enemy formations, American doctrine built on overwhelming firepower and rapid mobility through helicopter assault worked brilliantly. The problem was that Vietnam wasn't conventional warfare, wasn't open terrain, and the enemy refused to mass in formations where American firepower could destroy them. The reports from Australian officers serving with the 173rd Airborne described a disconnect so fundamental it bordered on the surreal. American units would helicopter into an area, conduct loud sweep operations with 100 or 200 men, announce their presence through radio chatter and helicopter noise, establish positions that required constant resupply, then express frustration when the Viet Cong simply melted into the jungle until the Americans left. Australian platoon commanders, trained in the Malayan emergency methodology of patient jungle craft, small unit operations, and silent movement, watched this approach with something between disbelief and professional horror. One after-action report, filed in November 1965 by an Australian captain serving with the 173rd, captured the fundamental problem in a single paragraph that would be quoted in Australian military colleges for decades. American doctrine prioritizes speed and firepower. Malayan doctrine prioritizes patience and information. In jungle warfare, information is firepower. Americans arrive quickly and accomplish nothing. We arrive slowly and accomplish everything. By March 1966, the Australian government made a decision that would fundamentally alter their Vietnam commitment. Rather than continue attaching battalions to American units, Australia would deploy an independent task force. 2 infantry battalions, later expanded to 3, with organic artillery, armor, aviation, and special operations support. Critically, this task force would have its own tactical area of responsibility, would operate under Australian command, and would be subject only to the operational coordination of United States 2 Field Force Vietnam, not direct operational control. The distinction mattered. Operational coordination meant the Australians would be informed of American operations in their area, would coordinate timing to avoid friendly fire incidents, would share intelligence. But it did not mean Americans could tell Australians how to conduct operations within their own sector. The Australian task force would fight its own war, its own way, in Phuoc Tuy province. The selection of Phuoc Tuy province as the Australian area of operations was itself a study in strategic independence. The Americans had initially suggested the Australians take responsibility for an area near the Cambodian border, where heavy enemy activity would have required close integration with American operations and constant American support. The Australians politely declined. They wanted Phuoc Tuy, a coastal province east of Saigon, far from the border sanctuaries, accessible by sea for independent resupply, containing a provincial capital at Baria and the critical port of Vung Tau. Most importantly, from an Australian perspective, Phuoc Tuy was an area where they could apply Malayan-style counterinsurgency doctrine without American interference. The province was infested with Viet Cong. The D445 Provincial Mobile Battalion operated from positions in the Long Hai Mountains and the Mai Tau complex. Local force battalions controlled most of the rural areas. Vung Tau might be secure, but venture 5 kilometers from the port, and you entered territory that hadn't seen government control in years. Perfect from an Australian standpoint. Difficult enough to justify significant resources, manageable enough for a brigade-sized force to impact, isolated enough to operate independently. The negotiation over command arrangements between Australian and American leadership revealed just how carefully the Australians had planned their independence. In meetings between General William Westmoreland, commander of United States military, Assistance Command Vietnam, and Lieutenant General John Wilton, Chief of the General Staff of the Australian Army, the Australians established several non-negotiable principles. First, the Australian Task Force commander would have full tactical control over Australian operations within Phuoc Tuy province. American officers could request Australian support for operations outside the province, but could not order it. Second, Australian forces would not be required to adopt American tactical doctrine, operational procedures, or reporting requirements beyond the minimum necessary for coordination. The Australians would fight using Australian methods, developed through Australian experience, executed by Australian standards. Third, the Australian government, not United States Military Assistance Command Vietnam, would determine Australian force levels, deployment schedules, and rules of engagement. If Washington wanted the Australians to do something, they would need to convince Canberra, not simply issue orders through the military chain of command. Westmoreland agreed, perhaps because he assumed the Australians would eventually conform to American standards once they experienced the reality of Vietnam, perhaps because he valued any Allied contribution, perhaps because he didn't fully appreciate how differently the Australians intended to operate. Whatever his reasoning, the command relationship that emerged was unique in the Vietnam War. The Australian task force at Nui Dat reported to Headquarters Australian Force Vietnam in Saigon for national command, and to Headquarters 2 Field Force Vietnam at Long Bin for operational coordination, but took orders only from Canberra. American generals could advise, they could not command. This distinction would matter enormously as Australian operations began. The first Australian task force established its main base at Nui Dat in May and June of 1966, and immediately the differences between Australian and American approaches became visible. American bases in Vietnam were typically sprawling installations with permanent structures, helicopter pads, artillery positions, and thousands of troops. They were built near population centers, along major roads, with priority given to logistics and firepower over security from local attack. Nui Dat was different. The Australians chose a location 8 kilometers north of Baria, deliberately distant from population centers. They cleared a 4,000-meter radius around the base and forcibly resettled all Vietnamese inhabitants to prevent Viet Cong observation. They established a defensive perimeter with interlocking fields of fire, minefields, barbed wire obstacles, and patrolling patterns that made infiltration nearly impossible. Unlike American bases that relied on size and firepower for security, Nui Dat was designed on the assumption that the base would be attacked and needed to be defensible by the troops actually present, not by calling in artillery from other locations or airstrikes. This design philosophy reflected Australian experience from Malaya, where isolated bases required self-sufficient defense. It also reflected Australian manpower realities. With only 2 battalions initially, and the requirement to conduct operations throughout the province, the Australians couldn't afford American-style casualty rates from base attacks. But the most significant difference in Australian operations wouldn't become apparent until the Special Air Service Regiment Squadron arrived. The SAS, Australia's elite Special Operations Unit, modeled on the British SAS, but adapted through Australian experience in Borneo and Malaya, would become the eyes and ears of the task force, and their operating methods would scandalize American observers. The Australian SAS in Vietnam conducted operations that seemed impossible by American standards. 5-man patrols would insert into enemy-controlled territory by helicopter, then operate for 2 to 3 weeks without resupply, without radio contact except for scheduled brief transmissions, without the kind of fire support coordination that American Special Operations considered mandatory. They moved silently through jungle so dense that American units wouldn't enter it without clearing operations. They established observation positions within meters of Viet Cong trails and watched enemy movement for days without being detected. They conducted ambushes using techniques that maximized psychological impact rather than body count. The contrast with American Special Operations was stark. United States long-range reconnaissance patrols typically operated for 3 to 7 days, maintained regular radio contact with their base, and extracted immediately upon contact with enemy forces. The philosophy was, get in, gather intelligence, get out before getting into a fight. Australian SAS philosophy was different. Get in, become invisible, gather intelligence over extended periods, and selectively engage targets when the psychological or intelligence value justified the risk of exposure. This wasn't recklessness. It was calculated risk based on supreme confidence in their ability to operate in jungle environment, a confidence built on selection and training processes that were radically different from American approaches. Australian SAS selection in the 1960s was brutal by any standard, but what made it unique wasn't the physical difficulty. It was the psychological profile they selected for. American Special Forces selection emphasized physical endurance, tactical competence, and leadership potential. Australian SAS selection emphasized something else entirely: patience, the ability to remain motionless for hours, the willingness to move at glacial speed through terrain where rushing meant detection, the psychological comfort with isolation, with extended periods without communication, with the kind of independent operation where help was days away if anything went wrong. They were selecting for men who could become part of the jungle, not just operate in it. The training reinforced this selection, 18 months of training, compared to the United States Army Special Forces qualification course that ran approximately 12 months at the time. And a significant portion of Australian SAS training took place not in jungle warfare schools teaching academic skills, but in the Australian outback, learning tracking from Aboriginal instructors whose methods had never been written in any military manual. This incorporation of Aboriginal tracking knowledge into Australian SAS methodology was perhaps their most significant tactical advantage, and the one Americans found most difficult to replicate. Aboriginal Australians had survived for 40,000 years in some of the harshest terrain on Earth through tracking skills that Western military science still struggles to quantify. They could determine the age of tracks by moisture content in disturbed soil. They could identify individual humans by gait patterns in footprints. They could track movement through terrain Americans considered impossible to track through. When Aboriginal trackers deployed to Vietnam with Australian SAS squadrons, they brought capabilities that had no equivalent in American forces. They could track Viet Cong through jungle where American visual trackers saw nothing. They could predict enemy movement patterns by reading trails the way farmers read fields. They could sit in ambush positions and know from changes in bird calls or insect sounds when enemy forces were approaching before any visual or auditory confirmation from the enemy themselves. The American response to Australian SAS operations evolved through several phases, each more frustrated than the last. Initially, American liaison officers assigned to work with the Australians assumed the SAS operated roughly like American long-range reconnaissance patrols, just with different terminology. They expected similar mission profiles, similar coordination requirements, similar risk assessments. The first indication that something was fundamentally different came when American officers requested Australian SAS support for intelligence gathering in a particularly difficult area of Phuoc Tuy province. The American plan called for a 3-day reconnaissance patrol, helicopter insertion and extraction, continuous radio contact with coordinates updated every 4 hours, and pre-planned artillery support on call. The Australian SAS patrol leader listened to this briefing, then proceeded to ignore virtually every element of it. His patrol, inserted by helicopter, then walked 12 kilometers from the insertion point before beginning their actual mission, specifically to defeat any enemy monitoring of helicopter landing zones. They maintained radio silence, except for one brief scheduled transmission per 24-hour period. They remained in the area not 3 days, but 17 days, moving between observation positions, gathering intelligence on enemy patterns rather than enemy locations at specific moments. They called in no artillery, engaged no enemy forces directly, and extracted from a different location than they had inserted into. The intelligence they provided was extraordinary. Detailed maps of Viet Cong trail networks, complete with estimates of which trails carried what type of traffic and when. Identification of supply caches, communication relay points, and leadership meeting locations. Information on enemy strength, morale, equipment, and operational patterns that no 3-day patrol could possibly gather. But the Americans didn't know what to do with it. American doctrine was built on finding enemy forces and destroying them with firepower. Australian intelligence was about understanding enemy patterns so thoroughly you could predict their behavior, then exploiting that predictability through carefully planned ambushes and raids. The conceptual gap was enormous. American battalion commanders wanted to know where the enemy was right now, so they could call in artillery or airstrikes. Australian task force commanders wanted to know where the enemy would be next week, so they could position forces to ambush them with minimal friendly casualties and maximum psychological impact. This difference in operational philosophy led to increasing friction as 1966 progressed into 1967. American general officers visiting Phuoc Tuy province would observe Australian operations and conclude the Australians weren't aggressive enough, weren't generating sufficient enemy casualties, weren't contributing adequately to the overall war effort. The most famous critique came from General William Westmoreland himself during a visit to the Australian Task Force in January 1967. After observing Australian operations, Westmoreland publicly described the Australian approach as very inactive, implying the Australians were avoiding combat. The comment created a minor diplomatic incident. Australian Task Force Commander Brigadier Stuart Graham responded through official channels with barely contained fury. His task force had been in Vietnam for 8 months. They had conducted continuous operations throughout Phuoc Tuy province. They had achieved a kill ratio exceeding 10-1 while sustaining the lowest casualty rate of any comparable Allied force, and most significantly, they had reduced Viet Cong activity in their area of operations to the point where enemy forces were avoiding contact, not because Australians were inactive, but because the Viet Cong had learned that encountering Australian patrols usually ended badly. The clash between Westmoreland and Graham highlighted a fundamental disconnect that would persist throughout the Australian commitment to Vietnam. American military culture in the 1960s measured success through metrics: enemy killed, artillery rounds fired, helicopter sorties flown, operations conducted. More was better. Higher numbers meant winning. Australian military culture, shaped by Malayan emergency experience, measured success differently. Reduction in enemy activity, extension of government control into previously contested areas, improved security for civilian populations, degradation of enemy morale and capability. These weren't things you could measure in daily statistics. They emerged over months of patient operations. The Battle of Long Tan in August 1966 proved Australian methods worked, even when facing overwhelming enemy force. D Company of the 6th Battalion Royal Australian Regiment, 108 men, stumbled into a prepared Viet Cong ambush position occupied by over 2,000 enemy troops during a patrol operation. By American doctrine, D Company should have been annihilated. They were outnumbered 20-1, caught in the open against an entrenched enemy with mortar support, separated from their base by several kilometers of rubber plantation. D Company didn't get annihilated. They fought a defensive action that lasted 4 hours in a monsoon rainstorm, called in artillery fire so close it wounded Australian soldiers, held their position until relief forces arrived with armored personnel carriers, then went on the offensive and drove the Viet Cong from the battlefield. Australian casualties: 18 killed, 24 wounded. Estimated enemy casualties: 245 confirmed killed, with many more wounded bodies dragged away. The battle showcased several distinctly Australian tactical principles. First, junior officers and non-commissioned officers made independent tactical decisions without waiting for higher command approval, because Australian training emphasized initiative at the lowest possible level. Second, Australian artillery coordination was practiced and precise, because Australian doctrine assumed infantry would need artillery support and trained for that integration constantly. Third, Australian soldiers were trained in individual marksmanship to a standard far exceeding American qualification requirements, because Australian doctrine assumed small units would face larger enemy forces and every shot needed to count. Fourth, Australian infantry didn't panic when surrounded, because Australian training assumed operations would sometimes go wrong, and soldiers needed the mental conditioning to fight through chaos. The Battle of Long Tan should have settled questions about Australian tactical effectiveness. It didn't. American senior officers continued to critique Australian operations as insufficiently aggressive, failing to understand that Australian aggression looked different from American aggression. American aggression was loud, obvious, massed. Australian aggression was patient, precise, continuous. Australian infantry battalions conducted 24-hour patrolling operations continuously throughout their areas of operation. Not large unit sweeps that announced their presence, but small platoon and section-level patrols that were invisible to anyone not directly in their path. Australian SAS conducted reconnaissance and ambush operations that kept Viet Cong forces off balance, never knowing when they were being observed, never secure in territory they nominally controlled. Australian artillery harassment fires were carefully planned based on intelligence rather than random, actually interrupting enemy activity rather than just making noise. By 1968, the differences between Australian and American operational methods had hardened into institutional frustration on both sides. American generals wanted Australians to conduct large unit operations outside Phuoc Tuy province in support of American campaigns. Australians preferred to continue pacification operations within their province, arguing that spreading forces across multiple provinces reduced effectiveness. American commanders wanted Australians to increase body count statistics to match American production. Australians argued that body count was a meaningless metric that incentivized wasteful operations and didn't measure actual progress in counterinsurgency. The relationship reached breaking point during the 1968 Tet Offensive, when American command wanted Australian forces to deploy outside their province for extended periods. The Australian task force did deploy, fought effectively during the Battle of Coral Balmoral against regular North Vietnamese Army forces, then returned to Phuoc Tuy province, despite American requests to remain in the operational area. The Australian position was clear. They had been given responsibility for Phuoc Tuy province. They would fulfill that responsibility by pacifying Phuoc Tuy province. If American command wanted Australians to operate elsewhere, they would need to convince the Australian government to change the task force's mission because the task force commander took orders only from Canberra. This stance infuriated some American officers who viewed it as alliance partners refusing to contribute fully to the war effort. But it reflected Australian strategic calculation. Australian forces were small. If spread too thin across multiple provinces supporting American operations, they would achieve nothing significant anywhere. Concentrated in one province, using Australian methods, they could demonstrate what effective counterinsurgency looked like. And that demonstration, Australian leadership believed, was their most valuable contribution to the war effort. Not adding 8,000 more trigger pullers to American operations, but showing there was an alternative approach. The statistical record of Australian operations in Phuoc Tuy province supports their argument. By 1969, enemy-initiated incidents in the province had dropped by over 70% compared to 1966 levels. Viet Cong main force units had been driven into border areas or forced to operate at greatly reduced strength. Local force units and political infrastructure remained, but were increasingly unable to operate openly. Road security improved to the point where Route 15, the main supply route from Vung Tau to Saigon, saw declining attack rates. Villages that had been Viet Cong-controlled became contested, then government-influenced. This progress wasn't achieved through massive firepower or large unit operations. It was achieved through patient, persistent operations that gave the enemy no rest, no sanctuary, no ability to plan operations without Australian forces disrupting them. Australian patrols were constantly in the jungle, constantly observing, constantly ready to ambush enemy movement. Australian SAS kept Viet Cong leadership uncertain about what the Australians knew, creating paranoia that degraded enemy decision-making. The crown jewel of Australian operational success came during Operation Marsden in 1969, when Australian intelligence, gathered primarily through SAS reconnaissance, located a massive Viet Cong supply cache and headquarters complex in the Mae Tau Mountains. The operation that followed was distinctly Australian in execution. Rather than simply bombing the complex or launching a large assault, Australian forces sealed approach routes, established observation positions, and waited. Over 6 weeks, they intercepted Viet Cong forces attempting to reach the complex, captured prisoners who provided additional intelligence, and gradually tightened the cordon. When they finally assaulted, they found weapons sufficient to equip 2 battalions, medical supplies for a major field hospital, and intelligence documents that provided insights into Viet Cong command structure throughout the region. The operation devastated D445 Battalion's capability and provided intelligence value that echoed through Allied operations for months, and it was accomplished with minimal Australian casualties through patient intelligence gathering, followed by precisely executed operations. Yet despite this record, American criticism of Australian methods continued. In 1969, Lieutenant General Julian Ewell, commanding officer of 2nd Field Force Vietnam, visited Phuoc Tuy province and declared it a disaster because Australian body count statistics didn't meet his expectations. Never mind that enemy activity had plummeted. Never mind that security had improved dramatically. Never mind that Australian operations had degraded enemy capability while sustaining minimal friendly casualties. Ewell measured success by enemy killed per day, and by that metric, the Australians weren't killing enough people. The Australian response to this criticism was diplomatic in official channels, but scathing in private communications. One Australian officer, in a letter that would be quoted in post-war analysis for decades, wrote, "American generals want to win Vietnam by killing every Vietnamese. We want to win by convincing the Vietnamese that the government side offers better security than the communist side. These are not compatible strategies, and we will not abandon our strategy to satisfy American statistics." This fundamental strategic disagreement was never resolved. The Australians continued operating under their own doctrine, using their own methods, refusing to subordinate their operations to American command beyond basic coordination. And American generals continued expressing frustration that their Australian allies wouldn't fall in line with American approaches. The relationship was professionally functional, but strategically divergent. Australian SAS operations particularly drove American observers to distraction. United States Special Operations Forces were trying to understand why Australian 5-man patrols achieved results American larger patrols could not. They observed Australian operations, interviewed Australian personnel, studied Australian training methods. Some insights translated: the importance of silence in the jungle, the value of patient observation, the need for better tracking capability. But other elements proved impossible to replicate: the cultural comfort with independent operations, the psychological resilience required for extended isolation, the almost instinctive field craft that came from rigorous selection and extended training. American Special Forces became better through exposure to Australian methods, but they never became Australian. What Americans particularly struggled to understand was the Australian psychological warfare dimension. Australian SAS didn't just kill enemy soldiers. They staged deaths to maximize psychological impact, bodies positioned to suggest they had been killed silently without alerting nearby forces, playing cards left as calling cards, exploiting Vietnamese superstitions about death omens, equipment rearranged in enemy positions overnight without anyone being killed, just to create paranoia, movement that left minimal traces, making Australian forces seem invisible, ghost-like. This psychological dimension violated American military culture that preferred straightforward combat. Americans were comfortable with overwhelming firepower. They were less comfortable with psychological manipulation that exploited enemy fears and superstitions. The CIA's Phoenix program engaged in psychological warfare, but that was separate from military operations. For Australians, psychological warfare was integrated into every operation. Every contact with the enemy was an opportunity to send a message beyond the immediate tactical result. Viet Cong and North Vietnamese Army documents captured during and after the war revealed the effectiveness of this approach. Multiple intelligence reports from communist forces referred to Australian troops with unusual respect bordering on fear. They noted Australian patrols moved silently, appeared without warning, struck from ambush positions, and disappeared before reinforcements arrived. They called Australian SAS Ma Rung, jungle ghosts, and warned commanders to avoid areas where Australians were known to operate. Some documents suggested Vietnamese troops preferred facing American forces to Australian forces because American operations were more predictable and less psychologically disturbing. This success through independent operations vindicated Australian refusal to submit to American command. If Australian forces had been integrated into American units, required to follow American doctrine, restricted to American operational patterns, they would have been just more Allied troops, adding marginally to American firepower. By maintaining operational independence, they demonstrated an alternative approach to counterinsurgency that achieved superior results with minimal resources. But that independence came with costs, both diplomatic and operational. The Australian government faced constant American pressure to increase force levels, extend deployments, participate more actively in American operations. Each time, Canberra had to balance alliance politics against military realities. Increasing forces beyond what could be sustained with Australian manpower would require conscripting more soldiers, which was politically explosive in Australia. Extending deployments stressed an already small professional military. Operating outside Phuoc Tuy province reduced the effectiveness of the Australian approach. The Australian government held firm on their commitment, but the pressure never stopped. Militarily, Australian independence meant Australian forces operated without some advantages American forces enjoyed. When American forces needed helicopter support, artillery support, medical evacuation, or tactical air support, they called American assets that were plentiful. Australian forces had their own limited helicopter squadron and artillery regiment. For anything beyond that, they needed to request American support through coordination channels, which was slower and less reliable than direct command. During major operations like Coral Balmoral, this limitation showed. Australian infantry fighting North Vietnamese Army regulars needed close air support beyond what Australian and New Zealand artillery could provide. Getting American tactical aircraft required coordination through American command channels that weren't designed for supporting non-American units. The Australian solution was typically Australian: accept the limitations and plan operations accordingly. Don't conduct operations that absolutely require assets you can't guarantee will be available. Design operations that maximize independence. Build logistics systems that sustain operations without constant resupply. Train soldiers to expect less support and make independent decisions. This approach worked, but it meant Australian forces couldn't conduct certain types of operations that American forces routinely conducted. They couldn't launch multi-battalion heliborne assaults because they didn't have enough helicopters. They couldn't sustain long-range operations deep in enemy territory beyond their artillery range because they couldn't guarantee air support. They couldn't rapidly reinforce positions under attack because they lacked the air mobility assets Americans took for granted. These limitations didn't make Australian operations less effective within their chosen operational parameters. They made Australian operations different, focused on what Australian resources could sustain. The ultimate judgment on Australian operational independence in Vietnam came not from American assessments or Australian self-evaluation, but from the enemy. Captured North Vietnamese Army documents from 1970 and 1971 showed Communist forces treating Australian-controlled areas differently from American-controlled areas. In American areas, Communist forces would withdraw when facing superior firepower, then return after American units departed. In Australian areas, Communist forces avoided contact if possible because Australian forces didn't depart. Australian platoons patrolled constantly. Ambushes were always a risk, and engaging Australian forces rarely achieved anything beyond casualties. One captured document, an operations order from a North Vietnamese Army regiment in 1971, contained a passage that summarized the enemy's view of Australian forces better than any Allied assessment could. When fighting the Americans, we select advantageous ground and withdraw when conditions are unfavorable. When fighting the Australians, we avoid contact if possible. They are patient hunters who do not clear areas and leave. They remain in areas indefinitely, making long-term operations impossible. This assessment captured the strategic success of Australian independence. By refusing to follow American doctrine, by insisting on operational autonomy, by fighting their own way, Australian forces achieved something American forces rarely achieved in Vietnam. They made enemy forces afraid to operate in their area, not afraid of firepower, which could be avoided, afraid of patient, persistent operations that gave no respite. The Viet Cong preferred American sectors because American operations were temporary. They feared Australian sectors because Australian presence was permanent. This success came at personal cost to the soldiers involved. Australian forces in Vietnam faced extended combat deployments, with individual soldiers serving 12-month tours in environments where they were constantly in the field, constantly at risk, constantly operating at high tempo. Unlike American forces that had extensive rear area support and frequent stand-down periods, Australian forces were mostly combat troops with minimal rear echelon positions. If you deployed to Phuoc Tuy province with the Australian task force, you spent most of your tour in the jungle or in defensive positions. There was no secure rear area where most personnel worked in air-conditioned offices and faced minimal risk. The psychological stress of this operational tempo showed in Australian casualty statistics, not in combat losses, which remained low, but in post-war trauma rates. Australian Vietnam veterans would eventually show higher rates of post-traumatic stress disorder than American veterans, despite serving in smaller numbers and sustaining fewer casualties. The constant operations, the lack of clear rear areas, the extended periods in high-threat environments, the small unit operations where soldiers faced danger without the psychological cushion of being part of a large formation, all contributed to psychological strain that would manifest years and decades after the war ended. But during the war itself, this operational tempo produced results. The Australian task force had the highest kill ratio of any Allied force in Vietnam, not because they were more aggressive in seeking combat, but because they were more selective about when and where they fought. Australian operations were built on intelligence, preparation, and precision. When Australian forces engaged the enemy, it was usually from carefully prepared ambush positions with artillery support planned, with withdrawal routes established, with every advantage exploitable being exploited. This approach required patience, discipline, and confidence in your doctrine. It required refusing to be pressured into operations that didn't fit your capabilities. It required, in short, the operational independence to say no to allies who wanted you to fight their way instead of your own way. When Australian forces began withdrawing from Vietnam in 1970, part of the Nixon Doctrine's broader Allied disengagement, they left behind a tactical area of operations that was more secure than any comparable American sector. Enemy activity in Phuoc Tuy province remained low. Government presence remained strong. Infrastructure remained functional. This didn't mean the province was pacified completely. Viet Cong political infrastructure remained embedded in some villages. Communist forces would return in strength after final Australian withdrawal. But for the period Australian forces maintained their presence, using their methods, operating under their command, they achieved what American doctrine claimed to seek: population security and reduced enemy capability. They achieved it not by following American commands, but by refusing those commands and fighting their own war. The lesson American military institutions would eventually grudgingly absorb from the Australian experience in Vietnam was that doctrine matters more than firepower, that patience produces better results than aggression, that small units with operational independence can achieve effects large units with rigid command cannot. These lessons wouldn't be fully integrated into American military thinking until decades later, after Iraq and Afghanistan forced American forces to relearn counterinsurgency through painful experience. But the lessons were always there, written in Australian after-action reports, documented in Australian operational summaries, visible in Australian results. The Australians proved you could fight Vietnam differently and achieve better outcomes. The Americans just couldn't bring themselves to learn from a force 1/60th their size that insisted on doing things their own way. The refusal of Australian forces to accept American command in Vietnam wasn't insubordination. It was strategic clarity. The Australians knew how they needed to fight. They knew American methods wouldn't work for Australian force structure. They knew integration into American command would destroy the operational independence their methods required. So they fought their own war, achieved their own successes, and let the Americans complain about it. And years later, after the war ended, and the assessments were written and the lessons were supposedly learned, American military colleges would study Australian operations in Vietnam as examples of effective counterinsurgency. The very operations American generals had criticized as very inactive became case studies in how to conduct population-centric operations in hostile territory with limited forces. The very independence American commanders had found frustrating became recognized as strategic wisdom. 3 words Brigadier Jackson supposedly spoke in that briefing room in 1966. "We don't comply," echoed through military history as the perfect summary of Australian military culture. Respectful to allies, committed to the alliance, but absolutely unwilling to subordinate operational judgment to foreign command. The Australians came to Vietnam to fight, but they came to fight smart, not to follow someone else's bad ideas. They maintained that independence through 5 years of pressure, criticism, and diplomatic tension. And they left Vietnam with their tactical reputation enhanced, their operational methods validated, and their strategic judgment vindicated. 120 soldiers who walked out of a briefing room proved that sometimes the smallest forces achieve the biggest impacts if they have the courage to refuse orders that would compromise their effectiveness. The jungle ghosts of Phuoc Tuy province taught that lesson at a cost in blood and trauma that would echo through Australian military culture for generations. But they taught it, and in the dense, difficult history of the Vietnam War, that might be the most important contribution Australian forces made. Not the soldiers they deployed, not the battles they fought, not the enemies they killed, but the proof that there was another way if you had the independence to pursue it.